Well, let's turn our attention back to politics here in the UK and after the introduction of some key pledges from both Rishi Sunak and also Sir Keir Starmer. Where are the UK's voting intentions so far as we edge ever closer to that 4th of July election? Well, joined now by Twyman, Director of Deltapoll. Joe, thank you so much for your time this morning. Big question then, where are the polls standing today?
Well, they are standing today exactly where they were a week before the election was called. Deltapoll, our latest survey, has a 22-point lead for Labour. That has Labour on 45 and the Conservatives on 23. And that's exactly the figure that it was the week before. And it's a continuation of the trends that we have seen for a long time, not just for the last few months, but for the last few years. Conservatives have not been ahead in any published poll since the 6th of December 2021, and Labour have had a double-digit lead since the 26th of September 2022. If that were replicated at a general election, we would expect that that would be enough for a majority of over 250. So as things start at the campaign, it's looking good for Labour, but polls were only ever a snapshot of public opinion at the present time, and we have a fair few weeks left of the campaign, and so things could still change.
They certainly could, and we will certainly be living and breathing opinion polls over the duration of the campaign. Just talk to us about how the opinion polls are collated. What's the methodology behind them?
Well, we conduct surveys using online panels, as indeed nearly all of the pollsters in this country do. And so we represent a sample, we gather a sample that is representative of the voting public as a whole, not just those who are online. We make sure that we balance things out between the right number of old people, the right number of young people, men, women, etc. But also beyond that, we make sure that we have the right number of Remain voters and Leave voters, the EU referendum, for instance, and the right number of Conservatives and Labour supporters from the last election.
This is an election about people, first and foremost, isn't it? Let's be honest, alongside politics and those people, two men, front and centre, Sir Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak. When it comes to them as individuals, how are they both faring?
Gareth, you're absolutely right that individuals, particularly leaders, are very important because it's often where the general public get their cues from. In other words, how they find out about parties and they judge parties often based on leaders. And the picture is not very good for the Conservatives again on this. The latest data has Keir Starmer on a net rating of +7. That means 7% more people think he's doing a good job than a bad job. Now, that may not sound great, but by historical standards, it's actually pretty good. It's up there with a David Cameron or a Gordon Brown. And it's certainly a lot better than Rishi Sunak, who at the moment is on -37. Now, that's not an all-time low for him, but it is the greatest gap between those two figures that we have seen in the entire time since Starmer and Sunak have been leaders. So it's not a position that you would want to start an election campaign in.
Joe, as the old adage goes, a week is a long time in politics. There's about 5.5 or so before the general election. Considering the gaps that you've just painted for us between the two parties in the polls, what potential is there for that narrowing, and to what degree could it narrow?
Well, if the last 10 years of British politics have taught us anything, it's that nothing can be taken for granted. But the kind of change that would need to happen in the campaign would have to be greater than has happened at any stage in British political history, certainly modern British political history, to bring about a change in the overall result. So yes, we would, by historical standards, expect the polls to narrow, but they would have to narrow far more than they've ever narrowed in an election campaign before to change the overall result and to keep Keir Starmer out of Downing Street. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but I'm saying that it hasn't happened in an election before and it's looking unlikely. And particularly when you look at the underlying data, beyond voting intention, but when you look at leadership and also crucially on the economy, you see just how static things are. Just over a quarter, 28%, believe that when compared to Labour, the Conservatives would be best on the British economy. Labour have a 19-point lead, and that number, 28% for the Conservatives, has essentially remained the same, unchanged, since June 2023. So in nearly a year, there's been virtually no change to that figure at all. Whereas we've seen fluctuations in leadership and voting intention generally, that has stayed static. And it's never been the case that a party has come from behind on leadership and on economic management to win the most seats at a general election. In many ways, that's the game. You get that, you get into Downing Street. And that is the most stable of all of the figures that we've looked at.
So that's the two main parties. What about the broader political landscape?
Well, the Lib Dems are on 9%, which is pretty static as well. They haven't moved very much. But that's exactly what you would expect, given their performance over the last few years, and it may still be enough to pick up a number of seats in key areas, particularly areas like the southwest, the constituencies, a whole swathe of them that David Cameron won in 2015. The Lib Dems hope to pick up a fair few of them come the general election from the Conservatives, and Conservatives who are perhaps sceptical on one side. And then we have Reform, the in many ways big success story in the polls over the last few months. Certainly at the start of the year they were on much lower numbers, but now they're on 10% in the latest poll. But the key question for them is, can they pick up any seats at all, and if so, where? Richard Tice is standing in Boston and Skegness, currently held by Matt Warman, the Conservative, and he obviously hopes that that will be the best chance for them. But if you look at Blackpool South in the recent set of by-elections, you will be hard-pressed to find, in many ways, a constituency better suited to Reform. And they did do well compared to the Conservatives there, nearly getting second place compared to the Conservatives. But it was Labour who won, and by some distance. So it's really difficult to see exactly where Reform can pick up votes, but they'll be hoping that the election will be a chance to expose themselves to voters in a way that they haven't had that opportunity before.
Joe, fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for crunching those numbers for us. Really appreciate it.